Thank you all for coming and for making this event a relational event of hearts and minds that are searching for the fullness of Christ in our midst. That's one of the greatest things about Oak Camper and has been for 25 years. And we've had three wonderful keynotes that have started us off great. So my plan is to have condensed two-day workshop into an hour, which is, and I've got a few key slides, and I thought the way we might do it, but I'm open to change, is to let me go through a few slides, maybe engage just a little bit of dialogue, because I really like to do that. But any one of us can probably go off on a long one and take us off. If we have time, I have a 15-minute clip that's very strong from a movie of a Vietnam vet who has a moral injury, and what I would say he has post-traumatic spiritual disorder. And it's a very powerful encounter with the father, who's a World War II vet. And you see a missed meeting, what Martin Buber would call a missed meeting. It's a very good clip that'll give us a lot to talk about what I want to present first. So if that's okay, I'm going to start off with this slide, which I hope you can see from the back. This kind of is an overview of what I want to say and have us look at. In the first scene, and each of these, in a way, is a commentary on what novelist Pat Conroy says in one of his novels, which I think is so good. The only story that kills is the untold story. And we're stories. Our lives are stories. And so we can look at the suffering and pain from the standpoint of giving voice to that which has no voice. And that occurs both within the internal world as well as what Father just alluded to in terms of the systems, where we have one of the aspects of post-traumatic spiritual disorder is the sin and sickness at a systemic level. So we have the indigenous population of America who we have committed cultural genocide against, and it continues, and we dissociate as a nation from actually looking at the damage that's done, and 42-year-old average death in the reservation in South Dakota, for example, and slavery. So we have two major traumas and moral issues in America that infect us as a nation systemically in a similar way that we are affected when we're fragmented and traumatized personally. So what happens here in the beginning in Genesis 3? How would you think about the beginning of spiritual pain in the garden? What is this? How does this relate to the untold story? Well, God comes looking for humanity. And it's probably not that there were two people named Adam and Eve, Adam of the earth. This was the origin of humanity. And what happened to this royal priesthood who stood between the created order and the uncreated order as people who lifted up Eucharistically every particle of the created order? Something occurred, and it was a very subtle suggestion to take the creation without the Creator, deny the Eucharistic element of creation, and in doing so, subject ourselves to being reduced to only created potential without an uncreated encounter. If you see that in a personal relationship, you see the objectification and the desacralizing of the other. I want what you have to offer me, but I don't want you. This is horrible. This is the loss of our humanity, the loss of theos' potential, the loss of personhood. And at the systemic level in our culture, we could go off on a whole area of what it means to continually extract production out of people and reduce us to ciphers in a system that have no value unless we produce something that creates something for mammon. So we lose the Eucharist, and we make what Clement of Alexandria, which I discovered, and I love this in his Stromata, he says, the voluptuous choice. The world and the creation is voluptuous. This is how God created it. St. Maximus the Confessor says that all of the creation came from the Creator's heart and his eros. It all expresses this, the logi, the spiritual essences. So it's desirable. Just like Satan said, this apple is desirable. But our mistake is when we, as James says, the desire in our heart assimilates, surrounds the other, and makes a monologue, eliminates the between and the otherness of the creation. So there can be no dialogue. So the sin monologue is Lucifer. We enter into this and we lose ourselves, we lose the creation, and we lose the Creator. What's the untold story here? Well, God says, Adam and Eve, I want to commune with you. Where are you? What you up to? I want to be with you. I want to have this dialogos. And you know the story. It doesn't get told. Adam says, she did it. She, as you often hear, she, her. That serpent. And so God says, oy vey, okay, it's me. I did it. And thus we hear a prelude to what Father Lev Gillette says is, there was a cross in the heart of God before there was one in Jerusalem. The image of God includes the suffering servant who bears the cross already from the act of creation. He knows that in order to create humanity and invite us to personhood, which is to receive the divine life, the entire divine life, we cannot be robots. The cost of not making robots is the existence of evil. Because I may say no. At least for a little while, because we're immature, like some of the fathers, St. Irenaeus. We were immature, spiritually naive. We have to grow. There's something essential about making mistakes in the creation to prepare us for that time where all shall be well and there shall be no suffering anymore. Okay, so the story doesn't get told. We start lying and hiding from the beginning. Now, I love this painting from Delacroix of Jacob and the angel, sometimes referred to as God, who are in a struggle. Now, Israel can be defined as one who struggles with God, because Jacob, the heel grabber, gets the name Israel after he's wounded by this struggle. Now, what do we know about the struggle? We know that he could not prevail over the one he struggled with. And yet, he gets the new name and the blessing of being knocked out of joint because he struggled with God and prevailed. Orthodoxy is paradoxy. He prevailed over the one he can't prevail over. What is this? What is this about? How many think Bethlehem means house of bread? Come on, be honest. You've heard this, right? I want to give you another possibility. Beth is house. We'll go with that. But lechem has two meanings. The first one is leaven. Because you're stretching and you're leavening. That's okay, bread. House of bread. There's a second one. Just like the cross, the disciples didn't want to hear about that. We don't pay much attention to that second one. The second one means hand-to-hand combat. So what if the God, the Son of God of Israel, the one who struggles with God and is wounded and cannot prevail over this thing, and yet prevails, what if the Son of God is born in the house of struggle? And the fruit of his struggle, the bread of life, the tree of life, the cross, comes from this. And that actually we're being told that to give us the divine life will require a struggle, not only for God, because he is wounded, but for us. So in modern language, we might say, God willingly accepts a traumatic event, not just on 33 AD, but throughout time from the beginning to the end. So that everywhere there's human suffering, this is part of God's cross that is willingly accepted. So as St. Gregory Nazianzus says, if any part of creation is not assumed, it cannot be healed. So our entire suffering order of creation is assumed. But it's not a magic carpet that we jump on and then don't have to suffer. We're invited to share that life, that heart, to have God's heart. And God's heart is a heart of flesh, not a heart of stone. It's from Ezekiel. So, this is the middle part. And what about this? How would we see the cross as the story that's untold? Why does the Son of God get crucified? He's not, we don't know who he is. And he says, forgive them, Father, because they know not what they do. The story still has not been told and heard. So there's something that goes through, and it's been pointed out in the New Testament. The disciples, at every place the cross is mentioned, don't get it, don't want it, and actually refuse it. And what are they doing instead? Who's going to be on your right? Who's going to be on your left? Who's the greatest? This is almost, it sounds ridiculous when we think of the saints and the martyrs, and yet the disciples gave us their memoirs that while they were with Jesus Christ for 3 years, sat at his feet, heard his teaching, saw him transfigured, and even Peter was momentarily illumined from beyond the created order and got in his way within 5 seconds. This shows us that in their wisdom and humility of their later years, they gave us a message in a bottle that said, brothers and sisters who are part of the one life we are, we lived with him, we saw him ascend into heaven, and some still doubted. We didn't get it. There's something here that's so far beyond your comprehension of the created order that it cannot be comprehended, and you won't get it either, and you'll think you do just like we did. That is really vital intel, Sean. All right. Let's see. So, we'll draw from a Protestant. He may have been prophetic in a way beyond what he knew. The most profound experience of the self is the experience of conscience. So let's move beyond the psychic world, in a sense, to the place that is the organ of the heart that noetically encounters what is uncreated, that is beyond experience and beyond reason. And yet, as St. Macarius says, whatever's communicated noetically to the heart is communicated to the body throughout the feelings. The mind interprets it afterwards, so to speak, subsequently. All right. This is very important because a lot of conversation in America these days about spiritual stuff is really about psychic stuff. And it lacks an ontology of the uncreated, and therefore it cannot speak to our struggle for personhood. It's still part of reducing us. And this is so it's an important thing to have clarity here. All right, that's the Vietnam memorial in the background. And here's Job getting accused. And the moral injury has come into the literature now through Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz, a psychologist, within the context of combat trauma. It occurs when soldiers violate their core moral beliefs, evaluating their behavior negatively, and they feel that they no longer live in a reliable, meaningful world and can no longer be regarded as decent human beings. They may feel this even if what they did was warranted and unavoidable. Killing, torturing prisoners, abusing dead bodies, or failing to prevent such acts can cause a moral injury. But we also know there's nothing new under the sun. And moral injury is a violation of conscience. There is the violation of conscience that comes from being a victim of perpetration, and there's a different kind that comes from being a perpetrator. And there's the kind that comes from the catch-22, in which to save this person, I have to shoot this one, and I'm wrong no matter what I do, and even if I'm awarded a badge for it, and everyone tells me it was the right thing to do, the deeper personhood in me knows that it is not the right thing to do. And so we have the paradox of war here, which is a very difficult one, and it goes beyond that. But thank God, so much of us, we've had so many gifts in terms of the dilemma that our soldiers and warriors go through, the suffering, trying to address that ends up being a blessing for humanity because it changes the mental health system and it changes how we deal with things. So one of the things that occurs from trauma is fragmentation. The core issue is the inability to integrate the reality of particular experiences and the resulting repetitive replaying of the trauma in images, behaviors, feelings, physiological states, and interpersonal relationships. Now, this is the biopsychosocial piece, but it doesn't get the spiritual piece. There are repercussions because that's what we are, biopsychosocial creatures, but we're also creatures with a capacity for noetic intercourse, for a heart of flesh and not flesh to have a communion with the living God. So what I'm suggesting is we need a bigger term, and so I'm using post-traumatic spiritual disorder as the post-lapsarian condition of the entire human race. All of us are suffering this. So what is spiritual pain? It starts here, and we all have biopsychosocial consequences from the violation of our conscience. So I won't say more about that. I've spoken about it in my book, and you can take a look at that. So spiritual pain, I'm taking that rather than moral injury because I don't want to be locked into that one communication. I want it broader. Violating or being violated by a personal agency and the loss of meaning to life and faith in God's beneficent intentions toward me. This is complicated by the accumulated side effects of avoiding reality by means of the narcosis of the various passions. So all that the fathers speak about in terms of the 7 deadly sins that Evagrius systematizes and all, I'm looking at all of this whenever it perverts the natural harmony of the human organism. This is a form of narcotic adaptation. There is a lure to it. And if persisted in, it becomes captivity according to the fathers, or we would say addiction in our modern language. Confession, forgiveness, making amends, ascetical struggle, restoration of meaning, and reconciliation to God and the human community are all necessary for the healing process. So we can't just, I agree that we give medicine when it's useful, but that isn't enough. I was invited to speak at the Pentagon, and one of the on this topic, and I made the case of the noetic and of the spiritual dimension that was deeper than the biopsychosocial, and a colonel psychiatrist came up afterwards and we dialogued for some time over the next year. He said, "Thank you for not losing all of this in neurotransmitters, because that's what's happening to us." This is not an easy thing to hold on to in a federal agency that cannot recognize certain things, but we persons in agencies are still persons. So as I mentioned, St. Macarius, the heart directs all organs of the body, and when grace gains possession of the heart, it rules over all the members of the body and the thoughts, for there in the heart the mind abides as well as all the thoughts of the soul and all its hopes. And this is how grace penetrates throughout all parts of the body. Now, some of the fathers, like St. Athanasius, and if you want to read about this, Panayotis Nellis in his book, I think it's The Deification of Man, speaks about the fragmentation that occurred in Genesis 3. The Western Church has typically understood this in a different way, but the Eastern Church sees this more as what I would say is congruent with the fragmentation of post-traumatic stress. It's the damaging of our inner life when we violate conscience and then we hide and lie. It splits us, and this fits with inter-family system therapy and other modes of therapy that see that we're not one. In fact, if anyone can find the quote from Evagrius Ponticus that I can no longer lay my hands on, that speaks about many I's inside, many me's, please let me know, because it was a very early instance of the fathers recognizing the multiplicity of the psyche. All right, I think we've got time to show you a 15-minute clip, and then we'll open it for dialogue. This movie is, let me see here. The story is this young man comes home from Vietnam. He has PTSD, and he has a moral injury. His family cannot tolerate an encounter with him. So each one avoids him in some way, given their own issues. And so this is the last scene in the movie where the father has basically said, you've got to leave because he's not behaving and he won't adapt to the family life in this father's household. So let's take a look at this. It's 15 minutes. How many vets have we got in here who've been in combat? Okay, it's a couple of scenes that might stir you, but it's a strong piece. So let's see here. And this is just one movie clip. Think of that 5 years of working with people that take you through things and enact the rage and the internal drama with you, and activate the things in you that are receptive to that. What a folie à deux we can create without this passion that allows engagement but separation, so there's a between. Let's talk about your reactions and anything that pertains to what we've been speaking about here. This is a story that was trying to get told, and the father had a story too. Each of them do. And in the mix of the stories trying to get told, there are lots of dead ends. Yes, please use that. And if you have a comment you want to make or any questions, and we'll stop about 5 minutes because I want to hit a couple of slides before we end to finish this out. But let's hear some conversation.
I find this thought of the Untold story very, very helpful to me, so thank you very much. I work in hospice. I work in California.
Can you hear her? Speak very loud. That's not.
I was thanking you for the concept of the Untold story. This is of great help to me now. I've worked in hospice for 20 years. I also do private psychotherapy. And in California, we have just had a law come into effect in June that's called Death with Dignity. It is assisted suicide for people who are terminally ill. I've just said I had read about experiences of professionals working with this, and I've just had a personal experience with a patient, and I have several others who are thinking about it. And listening to Dr. Jenkins earlier today describe this response to a threat to our life with the reflex part of our fallen nature, I suppose, of wanting to kill in response. And I have often reflected in my hospice work that when there's a threat that we perceive to our life, we, in many instances, respond with the wish to end it. We want to cut it short. We cannot tolerate helplessness, lack of meaning, lack of even temporary meaning. So I find this very helpful to apply to my recent experience with someone that has gone through this. It's often a response based on earlier trauma, as very often happens. There's always a lot of pain that's untold, not understood, that comes out as a wish to die when we know we're headed that way. We don't want to tolerate not knowing. So it also occurs to me that as many things and norms change, there may be a growing number of untold stories, and that we are called to respond in stronger ways, be more aware of our own weakness, but also get ready.
Thank you, Ioana. In a way, certainly being at death's door in hospice is holy ground, and one question we can ask ourselves that we can learn from that and apply everywhere, so to speak, is how do I make space for the story to be told? How do I convey through my being, through my presence, that I'm willing to encounter you rather than get you to protect me from this question that your Jobian question, your Jobian being. Even Christ too, the disciples left him except for John and his mother. So from the egotism and self-centeredness of Genesis to God's kenosis in Christ is the making space in the heart of God for the human agony. We have little tiny bits of this, but this is the question. When I approach the mystery farther and farther into helplessness, am I willing to stay present and be helpless? Because if I am, the story may get told a little and God may actually appear in the between. But we're all afraid of God. We love God, but we're afraid of God because we're afraid of love. Afraid of love because we're afraid of vulnerability. And we're afraid of vulnerability because we're afraid of life. So we need to see this.
So that movie really had 4 untold stories in it, and we only got a little bit of one of the stories, and that was the Vietnam vet. So it just cracked open a box of a very complex story. I did want to comment, and I think it's actually related to this whole idea of stories and these referenda on assisted suicide. There was a referendum in Massachusetts on physician-assisted suicide last year. The Massachusetts Medical Society opposed it. I supported it. Why would I support that? Am I in favor of physician-assisted suicide? No. But I really see that this is a phenomenon that's actually occurring ad lib. You can go on the web and look out how to assist your own death. I really feel it's a professional and moral responsibility of the medical community to engage in this issue, and my guess would be if this creates an opportunity to help a patient explore their own values, their own reasons, and there may be actually fewer assisted suicides were this a legal option versus it being an ad lib option, which you just go on the web and get what you want. And that is an abandonment of the clinician, of the physician and the other healers of their patient. If we say, well, that's not our problem, it is our problem. It's a moral and professional problem.
Thank you, Dr. Engel. What you're saying also reminded me of a story of a philosophy professor who was dying, and he wanted to kill himself. He wanted to let the doctors let him die. And nobody could get him to get away from that. And then one resident sat with him and said, "Would you be willing to teach me what you're learning about dying?" And then he didn't want to die anymore. And so that's what happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The story can change with an encounter. Yes, over here.
Thank you for the video itself. Was very powerful, and it was in many ways very explicit of this idea of untold story and dissociative, I guess, experiences. It made me reflect on initially how when I visit a patient, it's almost like curiosity of, oh, for the patient, let's see what's behind this. Almost as if, let's see what's the untold story for the patient. And the clip actually reminded me that it's not simply just the one suffering, but it's also my untold story that comes in the way. Although we talk about the counter-transference and everything, I mean, I might be that father unconsciously when I want the patient, like, get out of here, this is too much for me, or I want to get out of the room, because my untold story comes in the way of whatever the suffering is for them. So this idea of the untold story is true not just for, or we're all in it, so to say. The suffering is true for me.
It's beautiful. That's beautiful. The reciprocity of the healing process is very real and maybe not clear enough. The physician, the therapist, the confessor are healed by Christ through the encounter with the other person. Even St. Gregory Palamas, in one of his homilies, said, if the father who's hearing the confession doesn't have grace or is blocked by sins, the grace given to the penitent who comes to them with the need will be given to the Father in order to minister to them. So that is a very important confirmation that something greater is occurring than, it's not monologue and it's not simply dialogue. It is the Lord is coming through me to love you, and I am going through the Lord with my face on the ground in repentance to encounter you, and I'm receiving Eucharistically the Lord through you. This is the way life is, only we go into it resisting this. Because it fits with that whole notion that if I really show up, I'm response-able. Not responsible. I'm response-able. That means I don't know ahead of time if I'm right. I don't have a controlled experiment that will show me that the thing I do is going to produce the results that I want. I'm actually going to have to be open to an other. An other here, an other here, and an other here. In the back.
Deacon, thank you so much.
Very loud and into that mic.
Yes, sir. So given my location and the type of clients that I see with substance abuse, about 30 to 40% of the people who I see are coming to me directly from the armed forces. Rarely, if ever, I would actually say never, is substance abuse the root of their issue. But I will say that based upon the portrayal within this movie and kind of even with what I see with my own clients, this is the end point a lot of times, the point of crisis. And I'm wondering, is there a way that we can combat this kind of desensitization that the general had hinted at from what you had said, in order to get our veterans prepared to tell their story, or able to, I don't even know if this is correct to say, but able to experience more healthily their combat?
A Special Forces officer told me when I was headed to the Pentagon, he said, I hope you will help them understand exactly what you just said. Because what's happened is, since World War II, the military has realized that human beings don't like to look another human being in the eye and kill them. So the military has to find a way to get folks to overcome the natural limbic system resistance to this and automatically act. which is necessary in the combat situation. But in training that side of the mission to go to war, they haven't given the attention, and perhaps they can't. Perhaps I would argue this is the civilian sector's responsibility, is to do equally the same job of getting them home by helping them overcome that and be able to be vulnerable again. There's a mission to go to war and there's a mission to come home. St. Basil, in his day, they had, I think it was a 3-year, you couldn't receive communion as you were. It was kind of a rite of passage to be received back. The recognition was that war was an evil, but we're going to fight it. It's a paradox again. And the withdrawal from communion was not punishment. It was a way of acknowledging the intensity of the issue, both from the faith side as well as the human struggle side, so that one could come back. Because it's not enough to say, get over it, put it away. No way. Because the word that is not a deed in relation to the other, which may be simply the word of silence, to allow the vet to tell you about the monster they experienced themselves at. The story goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And the other thing I would say to that is, if you've read Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's books on killing, he makes a very important point that if we teach people to overcome their limbic system and send them to war without having the dialogue that settles conscience, we give them PTSD. We split them. And if our nation does not tell the truth about why we're going to war and have a real authentic dialogue, we're setting our soldiers up to be abused by the war, because they know that the civilians back home are not paying the price that they are. And like he says there, what am I doing but other than trying to keep the guy next to me alive, but the thing we're fighting for is not real, in the sense that, like, the Gulf of Tonkin was not an act of aggression. The soldiers were shooting at seagulls, but it was used at the time to make the war accelerated. But it was only came out years later. So this whole inability to have a dialogue as a nation, which we see constantly in the news now on about any issue you want to pull out, is a function of our inability to show up with another person who's different and in love, not love, in niceness. Love, which means I stand here, you're there, you may even be my enemy, but we're going to have an encounter and then make a response-able choice based on the reality, rather than have an inclusion that's this thick, this wide, and underneath of it has all kinds of hatred and marginalization of people, or a kind of, I take a stand, which is full of hatred. These two ends of the same stick are useless, but they're like every marital argument. They go on and on and on until somebody says, settle down, deepen your presence, and make a choice. But why do we do those little things? We're scared. We're scared to show up and be responsible for my urges, you might not like me, the shame I bear from my childhood at what happened to me. I got all that internal world. And then what's going to happen out here if I'm a whistleblower or I embarrass my family by what I'm saying? The pressures on us are enormous. Who wouldn't be acting out? And so, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Not as a method, as a real cry of the heart that has begun to wake up at Gethsemane and say, I can't bear it, and I'm helpless. I need you, God. Then maybe the news touches the heart and we weep. Why do we weep? Because the body has started to experience what has been communicated through the heart, and now we are being changed. If we live in our heads, or emotionality, sentiment, or just willfulness, we're not being sanctified. But if we enter into vulnerability and helplessness and encounter one another and make room for the story that hasn't been told, we will be transformed, because this is who God is. God is in our midst, and God has, in a sense, a face as unique as each one of ours. So forgive me. I am too blind and too self-centered to encounter you. This is the truth. But there's a little bit of hope there that I can, and so for you too, and so I have joy at that possibility. We got to quit. Oh, okay. All right, this was just a slide that when the veterans that came back from Vietnam were not allowed to speak the pain, just like happened in that story, they were very upset, especially when it came from the chaplains who gave them, spiritual bromides that were just meant to fix you so I don't have to encounter you. So, no good. Elder Alexander of Gethsemane says, the amount of suffering that the soul can accommodate is also how much it can accommodate the grace of God. I love this one particularly because this is the Garden of Gethsemane, and it is Alexander of Gethsemane, and it's right on target because guess where the disciples dissociated and went to sleep 3 times when Jesus said, will you just keep awake? I'm bearing the brunt of this. Can you just stand there with me? No. So there's the paradox of our struggle. I will not let you go until you bless me. What do I want out of this struggle I can't prevail? A blessing. You have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And Father Zacharias of Essex says that when Esau was coming to meet Jacob, Jacob was afraid he was going to kill him because he had been a deceiver all that time, and Esau was driven out into the wilderness and came back with all of his people. But then when Jacob came out of this, he was so full of grace that when Esau saw him, he wept on his neck, and it was transformative. If you want to think about how to change the world, go here and come out so that there's a light that God shines through you because of this. And then from Father George Metalinos, the believer who moves within the territory of supernatural knowledge, knowledge of the uncreated, is not called upon to learn something metaphysically or to accept it logically, but to undergo something by communing with it. It is at this point that the Church's mission as the body of Christ is substantiated, as is her reason for existence in the world, to render humanity receptive of that knowledge which is simultaneously our salvation. Communion, to approach the body and blood of Christ without recognizing the deep mystery, is our failure to be in communion. Because when we take that, the first thing we do then is turn around and see everyone in the room from this position. This is our path. It's communion. The cross is the presence of God in humanity's experience of God's absence. Psalm 88 is a prayer. This is the word that I love. I had a soldier who had lost his faith. He was a chaplain, and he was controlling his daughters, his high school daughters' motions everywhere because he was afraid a guy was going to come on to her, and he just couldn't stand it, and he was ruining his family. And as we began to work together, what came out was he had been by the Tigris Euphrates, and he opened his Bible, and it said, by the waters of Babylon we wept. And he said, I felt God was mocking me. And it made him hard, and he came home hard, and he didn't have a heart of flesh anymore. And after, at some point, he started to tell me this untold story. And the untold story went like this. He had been in the staging area of a woman, a teenager, who was going to die. And he was holding on to her finger as she passed out. And at that moment, someone pulled a blanket off of her because they needed it somewhere else, and he saw that her leg had been blown off, and he was sexually excited. This was horrible to him because he had gone from a tender moment to suddenly his body, in a sense, betrayed him. Well, what had happened was there was another story behind that one. His 16-year-old babysitter had molested him. on a number of occasions. He had not ever dealt with it. And so now the control of his daughter had nothing to do with his daughter. He was controlling what he himself was not able to be response-able for. As soon as he was able to contact, to go back to this struggle with Jacob, those things that he could not overcome, that were beyond him, he came out with the wound of humility. He saved his marriage and his daughter and freed himself from all sorts of further problems and addictions, which help to keep us from this. Do I have 2 more minutes? No. Yes. Okay. I want to give one more example. And I may, for those of you here last year, I may have done that. This was a Vietnam vet, came with his wife. They'd been married 9 years. He was having sex with a bunch of different women that he didn't have a relationship with emotionally, and he was working overtime. Naturally, they were upset. Can you imagine going and just hearing, how many times did you have sex? Okay, that's 1 year without communion for this. Come back and see me next time. I had him look into his wife's eyes for 3 minutes. I've yet to come upon a couple who've looked into each other's eyes in their normal life for 3 minutes and not said something, done something, but just deepened the mystery of that presence. It always brings powerful things up, and I want to see exactly what's happening there. The only thing that moved in this man was one tiny muscle in the side of his face. I followed that, and what I discovered was, this is 25, 30 years later, he had never dealt with the grief of the man that bled to death in his company in Vietnam. And he felt that he was going to defile his wife with the horrors that he had experienced, the defilement he felt in Vietnam. So as he got intimate with her, in his heart, the veil that separated him from all that pain got so thin that he medicated by having anonymous sex and overwork. So you have to see those behavioral actions as part of the untold story. You can't look at them as a behavioral thing that you apply a canoni to. Just because of its behavioral thing, you have to understand it in the context of the personal dimension of this person's life. So when he said, I love her more now 9 years later than I did when I met her, it changed her. She then saw this whole thing differently. You love me more. So this she could bear and begin to work with because it took a completely different picture now. Glory to God and forgive us. Amen.